have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that this is the decision by the courts to treat the Wisconsin versus Yoder decision differently than anyone else has never been repeated. How would you compare the Hobby Lobby decision to that?
The Hobby Lobby decision is not a First Amendment decision. It is a decision interpreting the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is a statute that codifies Wisconsin v. Yoder reasoning. It's not constitutionally required. And so when I took Riffer to the Supreme Court in the Bernie v. Flores case, and the court agreed with me it was unconstitutional, we were restored to just the First Amendment as a protection. But religious lobbyists went back to Congress and persuaded them to pass another one. And so we now have a federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act that applies to federal law, and roughly half of the states have a similar law. It is a statute. It's not a constitutional right.
Thank you. Just one other question. You mentioned taxes at one point and said something about the Amish are required to pay taxes. Were you talking about Social Security taxes?
Yeah, not anymore, they're not. So the United States Supreme Court held they didn't have a constitutional right to avoid them. But they then lobbied Congress, and Congress gave them an exemption, which is the story of free exercise in the United States. They don't have a constitutional right to overcome every law, but lobbying for particular exemptions is a successful strategy. And that's why we have exemptions, for example, to children's medical care in a number of states, and it's the same reason we all do not pay Social Security taxes now. If Congress were to repeal that exemption, the Constitution would not forgive them. They would have to start paying again.
Are you aware that the 3 families that were involved in the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, that none of them are Amish anymore?
Yes. Yes. I had heard that.
If the United States were to sign and ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, would that force, do you think, a reevaluation of Wisconsin v. Yoder?
I think so, but because a treaty stands at the same level as the Constitution. So if it were to be ratified, it would definitely do that. It would also create a right against what has been happening at the borders. There is explicit language in the convention. In fact, we started a petition on change. I was always like, who needs a petition? I was so annoyed that we started a petition on change.org to say to the Senate, would you please just ratify the convention? These poor children have no rights under our Constitution, but under the convention, there's explicit language that no sovereign state can do what it is that we've been doing to children.
Yeah, you're talking about the Wisconsin versus Yoder was near and dear to my heart, because I've read all those books and everything. Because I grew up Amish, and I was born Amish and grew up, left Amish at age 25. I was deprived of a high school education, which at that time didn't bother me. I thought it was normal. I thought it was the right thing, in every way. But as I got older, and more, it bothered me more and more. And and I'm sure that I would have, advanced, or I guess in a number of different ways, I would have had a better life. There's no doubt in my mind. If I would have had a high school education, because I'm sure I would have also gone to college then. And so I've pretty much a blue-collar lifestyle throughout my life. And it's interesting, I guess, that it didn't bother me at all at the time. When I was 14 years old, I should have gone into 9th grade. But it certainly bothered me a lot later on, and I'm hoping, very much hoping, that eventually, sooner the better, if it ever happens, that ruling will be reversed. And these kids, these Amish kids, will have the opportunity to go to high school. And that will be a normal thing, expected thing for them. Because it just isn't right the way it is.
Well, I do think if a case went up to the United States Supreme Court now, they could not affirm Wisconsin v. Yoder because of the dictum in it about the fact that there's never any wrongdoing. We now have documented facts about the suffering of some in the Amish community, and it would be a different case.
Yeah,
so
you're saying they'd never get away with that kind of a ruling now, would they?
Never.
good, I agree.
Never. They'd be
And,
embarrassed
too
by
bad
it.
It was 50 years ago or whatever it was, but what, do you think there's any logical possibility that that ever will be reversed? And
Well, I think it's probably going to be reversed by people in your situation who were educationally neglected, and they challenge it in states like New York and other states where the compulsory education laws are relatively strong. Now, the problem is that we now have on record other religious groups tailing on to the Yoder reasoning. So the ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York are not educating their boys. They're learning Yiddish, Hebrew, and the Torah. They are not learning math, science, history, or English. So, and even more severe deprivation of education than we're talking about even in the Amish community. Some of those cases are starting to be filed. And I do think that those children, as they become adults, should have standing for educational neglect.
so the only reasonable way to expect that it could never be reversed would be just a grassroots nationwide movement, hopefully, and people, really badgering their congressmen and senators to eventually to work at this and hope.
Well, they'd have to badger their congressmen and senators to appoint people to the United States Supreme Court that don't put children second to adults and don't put religion above everybody else.
Right, thank you.
If in an ideal world, and they actually did reverse it, because actually it was for Amish, do you believe that they would require Amish children to have access to a guidance counselor, to have access to an appropriate sexual education? Because I believe that is one of the biggest problems that they have within the community, because these children are ignorant. They literally do not know what is happening to them, and they're being sexually abused because of it.
No, I
they have
agree.
no way to voice what's happening.
Right. No, children increasingly need better ways of being talked to at an age-appropriate level all the way through about how to protect themselves and their bodies. And that's something that is an ongoing project. With Republicans in power, unfortunately, there continues to be this belief in the abstention idea of sex education as opposed to actual facts. So I do think that the American public, and I think the younger generation, gets that this ought to be done according to science. I am heartened every time I teach my Penn students. I teach a seminar on law, religion, and politics, and I walk into press and I walk out, oh yeah, well, maybe we got a shot. Maybe we're gonna survive. So I do think that the next generation has the capacity to do that, but I think right now the politics are pretty toxic, and I think that it's very difficult to have the federal government mandating sex education in a way that's particularly helpful. That's why what we need as well is education about your body and your limits and your privacy through private organizations as well as through the public schools.
Are you aware that the state of Colorado mandated an education clause for sexual education?
Yes.
They reduced their pregnancy rate, teen pregnancy rate?
Yep. Yeah. And so what happened is Colorado created a mandatory, meaningful sex education requirement, and they radically reduced their teen pregnancy rate. True. Yeah. It's funny what knowledge will do.
I'm confused by your answer to the question about Hobby Lobby. Does the law have to give equal weight to, on the one hand, the Constitution, but on the other hand, a statute that's passed that seems to conflict with the Constitution?
So I think not, and that's the argument I made to the United States Supreme Court, and that's what the court held in Bernie v. Flores, that in fact the Congress couldn't mandate what free exercise there is. But what the argument is that is being floated, and this is what happened in Hobby Lobby, is they argue that the First Amendment creates a floor of religious liberty. So you cannot be persecuted against. But then they argue that there's a statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is an add-on. And the add-on says that you have hyper rights to your religious liberty, so that in Hobby, just so everybody gets caught up, what Hobby Lobby said is that a for-profit craft store, which was run by a believer, could decide that the women's health care was tailored to his religious beliefs. Now, that is a plain violation of Title VII. That is a preference for religion, and it's a violation of the Title VII protection against gender discrimination. The United States Supreme Court held that RFRA, when you run all of the federal laws through RFRA, that the head of Hobby Lobby does indeed get to craft his benefits package according to his religious lights. Now, Congress cannot repeal the Constitution without very difficult procedures. It needs a 2/3 vote, on and on. Congress could repeal RFRA tomorrow. And so the evil in Hobby Lobby is this concept of unlimited rights by religious believers over all others. That is the animating concept behind the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Until Americans make it clear that they don't agree with the concept that religious actors always trump the law, we will have a RFRA. Elected representatives think it was an easy vote. They wanted to be everybody's religious freedom savior. They voted for it because it sounded like such a great idea, but it turns out to be the harbinger of this era of extreme religious liberty, where we now have arguments that everyone has a constant 100% 24/7 relationship with God that determines everything they do, and they can't abide by any law or rule that conflicts with whatever their faith is. That is extreme religious liberty. That's the era that we live in. We will never get beyond that until these statutes are repealed. There's one in Pennsylvania. It's called the Religious Freedom Protection Act. They passed it before I knew it was pending. But we do. That's the situation we have. It's a statute.
Is the process for getting the Wisconsin versus Yoder reversed, would that be like a lawsuit among those of us who grew up Amish and were not allowed education beyond the 8th grade?
Right. It would require a lawsuit. The trick, as always on these issues, is the statute of limitations. And so you would need to find someone young.
How young?
Very young. You would need someone who's about 23.
Because we don't actually know how much it's going to affect us until we're older. Unlike you, sir, I went to my bedroom and cried when I was 14 years old, and my siblings started class that fall. I hated it, and I knew it wasn't going to change.
I read your book, so I'm very familiar with you.
Yeah, okay. So, you know, and the other thing is...
Well, let me just make a point about that, right? You are absolutely right. You have no idea, one, that your childhood was stolen, or that you didn't have the childhood that others had until you're an adult. There's no question about that.
Right.
The problem is the courts in the state of Pennsylvania are not open to a discovery rule, which is what you would need.
What about Ohio?
Ohio is not any better.
What about Wisconsin?
Terrible.
New York? Iowa? Somewhere? Indiana?
Any state?
Delaware? Delaware's better.
Okay.
But we do not have a well-developed doctrine of educational neglect, and that's what's needed here. And so there's going to have to be a series of lawsuits that may well start out as across-the-board losers, but you're going to need to have lawsuits filed and theories put out there, and when you lose in court, you're going to need to go to Harrisburg. And when you go to Harrisburg, you're going to need to say to elected representatives, we need a statute that says that we can sue when we're ready. Right? It is really a lot of the same arguments that we're using for the statute of limitations for child sex abuse. So if we get, which we're close, but I'm not going to jinx it, if we get a window in the state of Pennsylvania, which is a 2-year window during which the victims of child sex abuse have no statute of limitations on sex abuse, and then it turns out, which it will, that the world does not end, and Pennsylvania does not light into a fire that exterminates it, we will have those arguments. And we will have those arguments for educational neglect, and we will have them for physical abuse. Because right now, if you're physically abused, you have until 2 years after the age of majority. You have age 23. So for those who are coming forward and saying, I was actually beaten up by a nun, but I wasn't sexually abused, the answer is, it's just too late. So in the civil rights movement, which is really a revolution for children, what you're talking about will come. It's just going to be part of this larger picture. And I know it's not, I don't want to say be patient. I want to say get to work.
Okay, so, and then does the person, do the people bringing the lawsuit need to be affected by the Wisconsin versus Yoder? In other words, I graduated from 8th grade the year before.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
No. I mean, educational neglect is educational neglect.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Marci, so would you give us a primer on this statutes of limitations? Because the more I get involved in this, it just seems like that's such a central thing that we have to all, and you said let's all get to work. So can you just give us a quick primer of what these ordinary people in this room can do to work with you in that?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So I'm the CEO and founder of Child USA, which is the first think tank dedicated to ending child abuse and neglect. We do legal and social science studies in order to have the facts to end child abuse and neglect. And one of our signature issues is statute of limitations for child sex abuse. We have just started a 501c4, which is an advocacy organization called Child US Advocacy. It is mounting a campaign in the state of Pennsylvania asking everyone to call their senator and insist on a 2-year window. If you go to windowtojustice.com and you call your senator, because they only listen to constituents, they don't care if you're outside their district, and they'll hate you if you're outside Pennsylvania. And they'll yell at me if you're outside Pennsylvania. But if you go to windowtojustice.com, you will see what the 3 arguments are for eliminating the statutes of limitations for child sex abuse. We expect the Senate to vote on October 9th. So we have 10 days approximately until there'll be a vote. The primary issue in the state is that the head of the Senate, Scarnati, is telling his Republicans to all vote as a bloc against the victims. To the extent that the other Republican senators hear from their constituents that children matter and that you want to know who the hidden predators are that you can't know about because the statute is expired, that could make a difference. So Republican senators need to hear from their people. We had some on the Democratic side that were in opposition, but they've almost all of them changed their mind, and they now think it's constitutional and it's defensible. So it is literally Republicans standing between justice for the victims in the state and otherwise. And just so you understand, this isn't about the Catholic Church. It is, I mean, it will help those victims, but it's about every church. It's about the Nassar victims. It's about Little League baseball. It's about public schools. It's about private schools. It's about every child that's ever been abused. So, would welcome any and all support on that issue.
I have a quick question. One is, when was the chair of religion in the Department of Justice established and why? And then secondly, if I understood you correctly, you said that children have a constitutional right to thrive. Can you explain what is the definition of thrive?
Okay, so after the Supreme Court held in 1997 that Religious Freedom Restoration Act was unconstitutional, the lobbyists went back, and in 2000 they enacted a new Religious Freedom Restoration Act applied to federal law and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which are hyper rights by religious entities to overcome zoning laws and prison regulations. Truly the sausage of federal legislation. So our LUPA introduced the idea that you needed a federal seat somewhere to help religious groups overcome local zoning and land use restrictions. And so one of the men who was at the top of the Beckett Fund Eric Treen, moved from the Beckett Fund over into the Department of Justice. He's still there. He has the religion chair. And his charge at one point was focusing on land use, but it is really expanded to whatever request that religion has, they go to Eric Treen. And he has a staff, and it is their charge to help religion get better treatment. It is their charge not to worry about the separation of church and state. So that your tax dollars at work. When I say there's a constitutional right to thrive, that's really an amalgam of all the individual rights that exist. Children have constitutional rights under the First Amendment's free speech clause. They have constitutional rights under the First Amendment's free exercise clause. They have constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment. They have constitutional rights under equal protection. And so they have a panoply of rights that are a reflection, but a dim reflection of adults' rights. And we're literally working out what each of those rights means as we try to raise the floor.
How much do you think Congress's willingness to have a preference for religious rights has to do with the founding of this nation as a place where religion can be freely exercised?
The United States was founded in extraordinary and deep religious division, not unity. It was the diversity of Christian sects from the Quakers to the Puritans to the Congregationalists to the Catholics to the Baptists. In the state of Massachusetts, the Puritans killed the Baptists and the Quakers who did not believe what they believed because they did not believe what they believed. The Quakers in the state of Pennsylvania did not let non-Quakers hold public office. So we did not start as a unified religious country. And in fact, the intellectuals, the literati at the time of the framing were deists far more than they were anything else. And a deist was someone who believed that there is a higher power, the end, that did not subscribe to the Christian concepts of Jesus Christ or anything else. So the constant drumbeat you hear from some corners in the United States of that this is somehow a Christian country, that somehow this is a united religious country is false. It is absolutely false. That is not historically true. It's law office history. And in fact, we are diverse. We've been diverse from the beginning, and we become more diverse every single day. Professor Diana Eck, ECK at Harvard, has a fascinating website on the diversity of religious believers in the United States. We're now over 100,000 sects. We are diverse. We are not one religious culture, and we have many non-believers just the way that we did at this time of the founding.
So I tried to make the argument that the Yoder ruling actually turned the Amish church into a state-sponsored church. Do you have any comment on that?
In a way, in the sense that the ruling says that the Amish don't have to educate their children. But it's not sponsored in the way that the Supreme Court is now using the concept of sponsored. It's not underwritten in the same way that they would say that, for example, well, the fundamentalist Mormons were in the state of Utah, who were recently investigated and forced to disband the way that they were organized because they had become, the FLDS had become the government itself. There was no distinction. And the federal government went in and said, you can't do that. You have to have government and you have to have religion. So.
Hi, Marci, nice to see you. My group is actually filing a lawsuit in New York State.
Right.
But for a long time, we looked into filing the kind of lawsuit where we would have yeshiva graduates come forward, and be plaintiffs. Several lawyers have looked into that, and they've come to the conclusion that this standing would not be enough. That basically it would be a hard case to make that the reason they're suffering right now is directly a result of this poor secular education. Now, we all know that that puts us in a bind because it leaves us with very limited pool of potential plaintiffs. So they have to be parents of current students in the yeshivas. And most of those people would never come forward. But you did say before that graduates, I guess until they're 23 or so, would have standing. Can you explain the discrepancy between what we're hearing from other attorneys and how you view it?
Well, it sounds to me like what those attorneys are saying is that they haven't found the plaintiff yet that has the damages that can be directly traced to the failure of education. But the damage question is separate from the theory of the case. It doesn't sound to me like they're saying there's no theory of the case. It's that you don't have the ideal plaintiff, right? So it's really a matter of, just as with Brown v. Board of Education, it's a matter of shopping for the ideal plaintiff. And the plaintiff would be someone who has been destroyed by the fact that they did not get the education that every other child gets during that age bracket. And that therefore you would move the courts to rule with you. It's really the public interest model of civil rights, where you look for model clients and you put forth model plaintiffs and you try to get those in several different courts. You try to get a split in the authorities and you try to get up to the Supreme Court. It's a 20-year process, unfortunately.
What exactly is the link between Wisconsin v. Yoder and the rate of sexual assault inside the Amish, for example, or any other religious group?
So Wisconsin v. Yoder laid out a theory that religious actors don't have to obey the laws that apply to everybody else. And it continues to be cited as a precedent that you would use even in abuse cases. And so routinely in the abuse cases, we see religious organizations arguing that they have something that they call autonomy from the law. It's a phrase that was concocted by the Catholic Church and the Latter-day Saints. So the two sets of bishops agreed to start using in court this concept of, they call it the church autonomy doctrine. And the church autonomy doctrine is their theory, which is nowhere in the United States Supreme Court's doctrine, which says that they are autonomous from the law. And the case that they love to cite most to prove they are autonomous from the law is Wisconsin v. Yoder. So that's essentially kind of the birthplace of that kind of thinking. If Wisconsin v. Yoder had not been on the books, I don't think we'd have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, because they needed it as a citation to say that the Supreme Court had abandoned this way of thinking without admitting to the members of Congress there's only one case that ever did that. So it's, there's constant slippage. If you start really paying attention, if you hear people talking about the rights of religious liberty and the rights of free exercise, notice how they will frequently fall into talking about their constitutional rights, when what they're really describing is statutory rights or made-up rights. Constitutional rights don't do what it is that they're arguing they do.
Thank you. I like this. Statutory versus constitutional rights. That's awesome.
So important to understand.
I think we all agree that the purpose of education is to prepare young people for life. Right? I wonder if there have been any studies done comparing Amish educational systems for the last, 50 years, to conventional systems that are at work in our culture today?
Not to my knowledge. There really has not been enough study generally of the way in which religious practices have affected children. So faith healing homes, right? The real story on how many children die in faith healing homes. We don't have that. We haven't done vaccination studies according to faith, which we should do. And we haven't done this kind of educational neglect approach according to faith. So I'm a big fan of that kind of social science study, and I think that we're increasingly seeing the ability to get it funded. But right now, all we have is the anecdotes about the individuals who leave the Amish and then are incapable of getting a job or finding a job. And we have, of course, the extreme example of the fundamentalist Mormons who, when a boy is difficult, they kick him out and they drop him off in Phoenix or Salt Lake. They say, don't ever come back. Those boys are not educated and they become prostitutes because they have to eat, and they become drug addicts. So they're called lost boys. There's actually a name for them. So we have that. We actually have some pretty decent studies on that, on the lost boy phenomenon. We don't have so much on the Amish.
And I guess the reason I'm raising that question is because I live here in Lancaster County, and I'm not Amish, and I'm not ex-Amish. I have Amish background back a few generations back. But I work among the Amish, and I see tremendously, I would call hyper-entrepreneurialism. I see a lot of happy people, and that's not to take anything away from anyone in this room who grew up Amish and neglects the fact that their education was not completed. My heart goes out to you. I'm very sympathetic. But I guess I applaud your work in many ways. I think children are very easy to neglect, and I think we do it very often as a culture. But on the issue of education, I have some real questions about Amish education versus what we would call conventional education.
Well, I think the response to that is that if the child were capable of making an intelligent choice at the age of 14 and an informed choice, then you and I probably would agree. But they're not. The brain doesn't really develop that part of the brain until 26. So you can't ask a 14-year-old, and you can't, and so then the question is, does the parent get to decide whether or not they're going to be educated? We're really only talking about 4 years. And so in my view, and I agree, there is some highly entrepreneurial activity among the Amish, but there's also among the suburbanites of Bucks County. So I'm not going to ascribe that to being Amish. I'm going to ascribe that to being, there are parents who encourage their children to work hard, and that happens everywhere.
I agree, and of course, I was only bringing that up in the context of being prepared for life. Yeah.
Well, it's, you know, for the
children are prepared for life.
But for the Supreme Court, the compelling interest in education is not just being prepared for life, but being prepared to be an intelligent and informed contributor to Republican democracy, to representative democracy. You know, when the framers created the Constitution, they decided that we would have no direct democracy, that people do not make the law. The only thing that we do is we choose the people who make the law, and the only way to have a working system is if the people who choose those who make the law are educated and informed and can question. And so it's not just the problem of whether they'll succeed, because you probably don't have to send someone to school at all to become a really successful farmer. But we need people who will challenge and second guess our elected representatives, and without education at least up through high school, we're not going to have that. And I think we see the results of not having a well-educated citizenry, especially on matters of history, but that's another talk.
All the time we have, unless Marci wants to take one more.
One more, sure.
I was a child abuse prosecutor formerly, and when you talk about the autonomy from the law, it does not anywhere that I know of apply to criminal law.
They've argued in the criminal cases, but it doesn't. It doesn't apply in the civil law either. They made it up.
Oh, so it's never been heard in the Supreme Court, okay.
The Supreme Court has rejected it.
Okay, so when it comes to criminal law and it comes to actual child abuse, the only thing about that is there is autonomy from the law, because there's no group that I know of that would be a voice for the children that are being abused.
What?
Within the community. I mean, if you're an Amish child and you're being
I
abused,
see.
who will come forward to the authorities and report it?
Right.
And then you could say, well, there's autonomy from the law.
Right. Well, when you take a child out of school, you lose your safety net for the child. So between homeschooling and taking the child out of school altogether, you have a a real difficulty of those mandated reporters that might otherwise protect those children. Whether it's the guidance counselor, the teacher, the doctor, the dentist, somebody in that child's world, when they're isolated, they don't get that second chance.
Well, very sadly, we have to let Marci go. And let's
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we are going to go for a break, and we will be back at 3:55 p.m. for Michael Billy.